Listen. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a palace of lacquer and paper, a world of silks that whisper, of corridors that remember every footstep. In that dim and fragrant place, centuries ago, people lived under the weight of lineage and ritual, and yet still loved, secretly and fiercely, in ways that history almost erased. This is the story of one such love and of the fragile line between desire and duty in early Joseon Korea. A tale lifted from the careful pages of the court annals themselves, retold now with the hush of night and the tension of a court that measures every heartbeat. Long before the Confucian codes tightened like thread around the Joseon court, there were other currents in Korea's past where affection and admiration between men were not only recorded but celebrated in verse. The youthful elite known as the Warang warrior scholars of an earlier age, trained in arms and in poetry, and among the surviving fragments of their songs and the histories that recorded them are hints of homoerotic admiration expressed with the same gravity as loyalty and bravery. In other words, Korean cultural memory holds a strand of intimacy between people of the same sex that is older and more complicated than a single modern label can contain. But centuries can fold a world over itself. By the 15th century, when the Joseon dynasty emerged as the dominant order, Confucianism had become the court's compass. The state reconstructed social life around filial piety and household continuity. Producing male heirs was not merely personal but a civic duty. Where once a song might murmur admiration between companions, new anxieties focused on bloodlines, succession, and social duty. The old freedoms were squeezed by doctrine. Private affections that risked disrupting the lineage began to be read as threats to the state's stability. That shift, subtle in practice, seismic in consequence, altered how the court and the ruling elite interpreted intimacy. What we know of these tensions is not mere rumor but comes from an extraordinary historical instrument, the veritable records of the Joseon dynasty. The annals, painstaking, daily chronicles compiled by court historians and later edited into official copies after each king's reign. Record events, scandals, and private petitions with an obsessive, sometimes brutal, honesty. These records were kept by historians who followed the king everywhere. Their drafts and notes were destroyed once the official annals were made, a practice intended to assure impartiality and to prevent the rewriting of memory. When we open those volumes, we are reading what the bureaucrats of the day chose to hold as the truth. It is into this world of ritual and record that a young noblewoman named Bong Sunbin, usually referred to in English as Crown Princess Sun or simply the deposed Crown Princess in the annals, is brought in 1429 to become the official wife of the Crown Prince. She arrives under scrutiny. Her predecessor had been dismissed earlier for charges of witchcraft. A reminder to every woman who entered the palace that her life would be measured not only by etiquette and birth but by the unblinking eyes of the king and his ministers. For Bong, the pressure was immediate and elemental. The crown prince needed heirs, and she was expected to deliver the one thing the dynasty thought indispensable: a son to continue a line. Being a princess in Joseon was to live in a glass house. Everything could be read as meaning. When another of the crown prince's concubines gave birth to a son, the court's verdict was swift in its social effect. A child had been produced while the crown princess remained childless, and gossip replaced grace. In that cold arithmetic of favor and blood, Bong's reputation in the palace frayed. She found refuge in two ordinary, dangerous things: drink and human closeness. She drank in large bowls, a detail the annals record in their plain way, and she turned to the one person who answered when the world closed. A low-status handmaid whose name appears in the records as Sosang. The two women became inseparable. The maid later told interrogators that the princess had declared she loved the man she married less than she loved her maid, and that, when the princess asked her to, the maid lay beside her as a man would lie beside a woman. That phrase, recorded without editorial flourish, is a small human thunderclap in the dry voice of state history. Court life cannot abide such ruptures, because every personal misstep can be read as a political risk. When the intimate relations between the crown princess and Sosang became known, the stability of public face mattered more than private truth. The crown prince apparently confronted the maid, who confessed, but he did not move immediately to brand his wife. Perhaps he feared the scandal's political echo, perhaps he feared the personal shame. Either way, the matter rose through channels until it reached King Sejong himself, the king whose name is still spoken with reverence in Korea for his patronage of scholarship and governance. His intervention in 1436 led to the princess's formal demotion. She was stripped of her rank and banished from the capital, reduced to commoner status and cast out of palace life. Officially, the decree avoided naming sexual intimacy as the cause. The charges emphasized breaches of etiquette such as sending palace goods to her natal family and receiving visitors without permission. Yet contemporaries and later historians understood the underlying truth. The affair with her maid sealed her fate. The annals also record the grim fate of the servants. Some of the princess's attendants implicated in these intimacies were executed. A brutal reminder that in Joseon the social ladder was not merely descriptive but punitive. The nobi class, servants bound by law and custom, could be condemned to death for actions that a highborn might survive with disgrace. That asymmetry, one woman's loss of title and exile, another's death, is the kind of cruelty the Veritable records do not flinch from preserving. This story, a crown princess exiled, her handmaid executed, the king's decree written in neutral phrases that mask everything, tells us more than a private scandal. It reveals a court where the personal and political were braided so tightly that the slightest unraveling could change lives irreversibly. It shows that Joseon did not have a single uniform policy of persecution against same-sex intimacy. Rather, attitudes were shaped by class, by the perceived threat to lineage, and by the imperative of maintaining ritual order. Historians who compile the Veritable records did so with a vow of fidelity. Records had to be kept, drafts destroyed, and a single final version preserved for posterity. That very devotion gives us the raw material to reconstruct lives like Bong Sunbin's. Yet the same process reflects the values of the time, the priorities that shaped what was recorded and how. Sometimes the annals omit the word that would make things explicit, and historians must read between the lines. But the lines are there. Beyond this single scandal, there is a wider landscape. Across Korean history, there are mentions of man-to-man affection, of shamanic traditions that allowed different forms of intimacy, and of popular practices that continued even while elite discourse tightened. Same-sex relations were not uniformly outlawed by law in Joseon's early centuries, but they were judged through the lens of social duty. For women, the historical record is quieter, partly because elite men wrote most of the histories, and partly because women's private lives were even more likely to be policed or hidden. What remains striking, and why this story still matters, is how human it is. Bong Sunbin's exile is not only a footnote in a bureaucratic ledger. It is a plain human tragedy. A woman who entered the palace to become an instrument of continuity ended up exiled for the deepest intimacy she dared to take. And because the Veritable records survive, because these historians chose to write, we can still read the small, sharp sentences that let us imagine the warmth of a hand in the dark, the hush of laughter, the weight of a crown felt at last as a chain. After her demotion and banishment, the records fall silent. She disappears into the common world, a name whose later days we cannot recover. Yet because scholars and archivists preserve the words that mention her, and because we still read them, Bong Sunbin endures in memory, her brief, luminous existence in the palace continuing to speak across 6 centuries to anyone who will listen. So when you return to the modern day and hear how societies imagine and legislate love, remember the lacquer corridors and the bowls of wine and the quiet confession of a maid. History is not a simple ledger of right and wrong. It is the stubborn accumulation of human choices, with all their beauty and cruelty.